Hello, and welcome back to the Endgame class. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and today I want to be taking you through some critical endgames that have helped to determine the next challenger for Magnus Carlsen in the World Championship. Of course, these are endgames from the first half of the Candidates Tournament this year in 2020. I'm not sure when the players are set to play the second half just yet. Of course, it's still all up in the air at the last I heard. But these endgames in the first half are definitely going to be crucial. So let's take a look first and foremost at a position between the Chinese player Wang Hao and the Frenchman Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. So in this position, Wang Hao was playing with the white pieces and ended up with a pretty incredibly interesting endgame. So here, Black chose to play the move King G8, bringing the king back towards the center. And Wang Hao made a very interesting decision now to play the move D5, which allows Black to trade the queens. Oops, I've skipped to the end. Ruining everything, I'm the worst. Which allowed Black to play the move. Okay, so King G8, D5 allowed Black to play the move. Queen takes C3, Knight takes C3, and now Knight A5. Bishop D3, removing the bishop from the threat of capture, and after E takes D5, E takes D5, we have sort of arrived at the endgame I wanted to talk about today. So what do you guys in the chat think is going on in this endgame? Would you rather be white here or black, and why? And then we'll talk a little bit about it. What do you guys think? As you filter in here. What is going on here? Manny wants to be white. David says black has two connected pawns, but the D pawn looks dangerous. So you guys are arriving at the heart of the subject. Of course, the main imbalance to look at here is this pawn on D5 versus black's pawn on D6. Of course, the remaining pawns are sort of symmetrical. So the question is, would you rather have this passed pawn all the way on D5 or this more solid-looking pawn back here on B6? And in this case, definitely it's going to be white who is preferred in this position. The reason for that is this D pawn is, yes, passed and threatening to step forward and try to promote sort of at any moment, but also it's not really going to be too weak on the D5 square. The reason for that is the white king is very ready to step to D4. It can't really be driven off of the D4 square, and from D4, it will sort of permanently defend this pawn on D5. Meanwhile, black can add his own king as an attacker, but this knight is nowhere close to being able to attack this D pawn. In fact, black is going to have to work pretty hard to solve this issue of the knight on A5, which is sort of reason number 2 to prefer white in this position. Reason number 3 is for those of you with a tactical mind. You may have realized that this guy is not so easy to defend due to the misplacement of black's knight on A5. And in fact, there is simply no way for black to maintain control of the A7 pawn in this position. How is that true? Well, white would love to play, for example, after king F8, the move knight B5 and take this guy. Unfortunately for white, right now the D pawn does hang, but of course white can play king E3 and king D4. And now there's nothing to stop white from going knight B5 and capturing on A7. So we have the move bishop C8 on the board. Black needed to get this knight back into play. Knight B5 and now A6 tries to hold on to the pawn, but you may have realized knight C7 now adds 2 attackers to this guy. At first glance, you might think you can play the move B5, but now king C5 and king B6 is going to be difficult to stop. White is winning this pawn one way or another. So in the game, after knight C7, black simply chose king D6, and now we have the move knight takes A6. And we have arrived at the main position of the next 40 moves. This is sort of what we have to look at here. So the move knight b7 was played in the game, retreating this knight back to b7, preparing to bring it out to a more active square like c5 or d6. And now I think white's next move may have been the move to determine the result of this game. So let's really stop and think in this position. I'm going to ask you guys to spend probably a little bit more time than I normally ask you to spend here. Try and find white's best move in the position. And if you are someone who tends to solve these answers using a chess engine, it may not be able to help you here, because chess engines, while they normally arrive at the win eventually, they don't always understand what is the best practical move for an attacking player to try to make in order to win the end game. Whereas white's best move in this position, I think, is number one, very human, and number two, sort of the simplest way to go about it. So really stop here and consider your next option with the white pieces. Stop and consider here. Chess King says he likes f5. So he says g4. He says g4, g5 is his idea. Manny says bishop b5. So try and provide some sort of reasoning behind the moves here. Try and think long-term as well. Try and think long-term. So yeah, try and provide some reasoning with the moves, because I do think this is sort of the time to plan out your next however many moves, your next idea to try to make progress. This is the time to plan it out. So if you provide one move, that's not an idea to make progress. You have to understand that your move has to have an idea to progress the position forward, to be closer to winning the end game. So Mateo says knight b8 to play knight c6. Sure, but what is your idea to make progress? How does knight c8 allow you to make progress? How does white make progress in this endgame? And then how do you actually achieve that with chess moves? Endgames are very, very concrete things. So a lot of you guys in the chat have some like repositioning ideas, like you're saying, hey, wouldn't this knight be great on c6 compared to a6? And maybe that's true, but it doesn't have a concrete idea. You need some concrete idea to make progress. How does white make progress? He doesn't make progress by putting a knight on c6. Knight on c6 looks good, but it's not progress. So Krish has the first idea that I've seen so far that actually is an attempt to make progress. Krish wants to play knight b4, knight c2, knight e3, and knight c4 with check. Why is this an idea to make progress? Because it's not just repositioning the knight, it's repositioning the knight with the purpose of pushing the white pawn forward. So why is this an idea to make progress? What is white hoping to achieve after knight c4? Okay, and then Mateo has an idea. We'll look at Mateo's idea in a second, but let's start with this knight c4 idea. how does white continue to make progress after the move knight c4? What does white have to do? King e5. So Krish has the right plan here. So we would love to play knight b4. Then I'm just going to pass with black for now. And eventually play knight c4 check. King c7, for example. And king e5. And how is this making progress for white? Well, it's making progress because now white is going to be able to come through and win these pawns, or even more directly, come through and win some stuff over on this side of the board as well. Sort of devastating, right? So we have an idea to make progress with white. However, when you want to analyze an endgame, you, yes, have to come up with your concrete idea, but a lot of the time, it's going to be much more useful for you if you can try and find some way that your opponent can stop you. So is black powerless? Can black do nothing against the idea of knight b4 to c2 to e3 to c4 check, followed by king e5? Or in those 4 moves that he has, is there some way for black to make life a little bit more difficult for white? Is there any way black can put up some resistance there? This is sort of the next thing you have to look at. And while you're thinking about that, let's look at this. So Mateo was saying knight b8, and he wants to go after these pawns. So immediately off the bat, it looks like the issue is going to be, let's say black passes or something. Well, okay, this is a bit better than passing. Let's say, yeah, I don't know. Tough to pass. The point is, even if you get to e8, king e7 is rejecting this bishop, right? Knight d8 also defends the f7 square. So this idea, not going to be the best. So back to your initial question. What is stopping white from just easily winning the game? Knight b4, c2, e3, c4, king e5, king f6 to follow, d6 to follow, game over. What is stopping this from happening? So there's some ideas in the chat. One idea is for black to play knight c5 and bishop a6 that's being suggested. Another idea is knight a5 to sort of just very, very directly control the c4 square. And so let's talk about that a little bit, because what's at the core of white's idea here? The core of white's idea is not necessarily knight c4 check, it's to remove the king from the d6 square. And so these sort of artificial looking ways of stopping it for black, something like knight a5, really aren't going to work in the long run. So let's say black just plants this knight on a5 and passes, right? Knight e3, pass, right? It's true that you've stopped knight c4. However, what you haven't done is stop white's idea entirely, right? For example here, let me find sort of the best path to get there. Something like knight d1, let's say pass, knight f2, and knight e4 check, right? We're still sort of getting to our point somehow. If you try something like f5, well, I'm not so sure this is ideal for you to put the pawns on these squares. But we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth later on. The point is, knight a5, not enough to stop it. You do need things, something like f5 to follow as well, right? So what else? What else can black do? You guys were mentioning knight c5. Let's say white chooses to save this bishop. Or actually maybe just chooses to go knight c2 anyways. Okay, well then this is a problem, I guess. So let's say white chooses to save this bishop. Let's just do it simply with the move bishop b5. Let's say bishop b7, challenging the pawn. I'm kind of confusing myself here somehow. So apologies. Let me take just a second. Yeah, and this might be a little bit of a better way of preventing this idea. Let's say, though, instead I try a little bit harder. Play the move bishop c4, challenge or defending the d5 pawn. Now, bishop b7 still allows this knight to be a bit mobile. Still have ideas of knight c2 here. Let's say knight back to a6, knight out to e3, knight back to c5. And one way or another, we're getting rid of this king. One way or another. We're going to find him, and we're going to get him. All right. So the idea that you guys have not mentioned yet is the idea of defending the e5 square. There are sort of these tactical ideas to make removing the king from d6 difficult for white, but you sort of get the feeling that given enough time, white is going to be able to organize his pieces in such a way that he can challenge this king on d6, right? These sort of artificial-looking ways of trying to stop it by, pressuring this pawn a little bit or by just defending the square. They may work in the short term, but given enough time, white may be able to maneuver his way around to a square like e4 or c4 or b5 with the knight to remove the black king. However, there is sort of a better solution here for black to try and draw the game. And that solution is to put this pawn on g5 and put this pawn on f6. And the point now is that if knight e3, bishop d7, knight c4 check, king c7, king e5 has been prevented. And this is sort of the fortress-like position that black might be able to achieve. So if you thought of this idea for black, kudos to you, because this is a really fantastic try at creating a fortress-like position for black. Now something like knight to e3, this knight can step to d6, and it's going to be very difficult to break through anywhere on the board for white after this setup has sort of been achieved. In fact, I would go as far as to say I might think this position is sort of just dead drawn if black achieves this setup with g5 and f6. So let this be sort of a lesson, yes, for you as the attacking side to look for these types of setups for your opponent, but also as the defending side, always be on the lookout for these sort of opportunities to try and permanently sort of nullify the game. Because if you try these less permanent ways of preventing your opponent's ideas, stuff like knight c5 and bishop b7 or knight a5 that we were talking about, you sort of are always going to have to be on the back foot, always being ready to meet white's next threat with some new temporary solution. And at the end of the day, more often than not, those games end up being won by the attacking side. The reason being, eventually there's just a threat that black is not ready to tactically meet. Whereas if black achieves something like this, black no longer has to try. Black just literally does this. And how does white break through? I'm not so sure that he can. So now we have arrived at the point of stopping at this turn. We have found a winning idea for white. It's knight b4, knight c2, knight e3, knight c4, and we have found a drawing technique for black, going g5 and f6. And I do want to mention, somewhere along the line, maybe white has some tactical wins, something like bishop a6 here. So black might have to be a bit more cautious, something like knight c5 first, knight c2. Well, sorry, we might have to deal with this. So bishop c4, and now let's say the immediate f6 g5, for example. This is probably a tactically sound way of achieving the same idea for black. Even g5 first, followed by this move f6. So this would be more tactically sound. The first line I showed, I think bishop a6 might have been winning. But knight c5 first, followed by this fortress idea, would be good enough for black. So back to this position. With all of that in mind, how do you win with white? White to move and find a winning idea here. And yeah, Manny has a great idea. It's to play the move f4. And I think this is practically the absolute best move that white can play. I think this move in the long run ends up being winning because it's preventing this tactical idea for black to play the move g5 and sort of end the game. Mateo has a question first, though, about bishop d7 here. And I think I don't fully understand why Mateo wants to pause here. It would be a very similar idea for white, going for this, and black would still have to go for this g5 f6 idea. Oh, and I think I do remember him saying something about playing the move b5. So the problem with playing b5 is that the second you put that pawn there, you have another weakness that you have to defend, right? On b6, the pawn is relatively safe, can be defended by the king. On b5, that's not the case, right? This pawn is sort of falling, or knight c4 check is coming even faster. But okay, let's talk about the move f4, right? So with f4, white is locking down the g5 square and making this plan of blacks to play f6 and g5 much more difficult to achieve. Now, for example, let's talk about some drawing ideas for black. If he tries to fix the pawns like this, well, now the issue is going to be that white, once again, is going to be going for the plan of playing some type of check to this king, using the knight, removing it from the d6 square, and then playing king e5. And this, once again, is going to be very, very difficult to stop. For example, bishop b7, something like knight c2, and black might pass, knight a3, knight f6, knight b5 check, king d7, and this type of stuff is going to be difficult to stop. For the moment, black tactically has this threat solved with something like knight g4, but is that going to be a permanent fix? I'm not so sure. White also has ideas of playing d6 with bishop f7 to follow, and while I don't tactically see the win immediately for white here after g3, he still does always have these ideas of making progress in this manner. Perhaps, actually, I do see a pretty good idea for him. Maybe we can reroute in this manner. Sort of knight b5 check, bishop f3, and then this to follow with this threat being taken care of. Would be strong. Okay, so f5 doesn't quite do it. The reason being, king e5 has not been prevented. Other drawing ideas for black, let's say he tries to play the move knight c5, taking advantage of this bishop. Well then, I think the move knight takes c5 would be good enough, but we don't even need this trick because I think knight b4, knight takes d3, knight takes d3 would also be pretty convincing here for white. Bishop b7 is sort of the only try to challenge this guy, knight b4 to defend. And now, I think the issue is going to be bishop a8, king b5, and you just can't hold everything together here with the black pieces. Knight a6 check to follow, and this guy falls. So I do think that f4 is just a technically winning move here. Once again, if bishop d7, knight b4, knight c5, bishop c4 is going to be similar to things that we've just looked at. And even the move bishop e2 is going to be a perfectly playable idea, with the point being something like g4 and g5 to follow, with an extra weakness now on the king side for black. So with all of that in mind, f4, I'm claiming, is the winning idea here for white, preventing this perfect defensive setup for black with g5 and f6. So does anybody have any questions about this idea of f4? Does anybody think it's not good enough to win? Obviously, it's still going to be a complex endgame after f4, but I do believe this is white's best shot at a win, and from what I can tell, it should be winning. Every line I've analyzed deeply has always resulted in some way to break through for white. So any questions about this? So then the question is, everybody seems to agree, what should black do after white plays g4? This was Wang Hao's choice in the game. So what should black do here? What should black do here? And yeah, you guys all have the answer. Of course, black should play the move g5. And in fact, this is exactly what happened in the game. Wang Hao went with g4, MVL went with g5, and now I do actually think that this is a technically drawn endgame. I do not see how black is going to be busted here. I don't see how white is going to break through. In the game, Wang Hao tried knight b4, bishop d7, knight c2, king e7, knight e3, with an idea you guys may recognize. Of course, trying to take control of d6, but now after knight d6, king e5 is meaningless because of f6 check. Knight d1 was played, bishop a4, knight f2, f6, and black has achieved his desired fortress. The players played on for many turns, but black now was happy with repetitions until he found this opportunity to play knight c7 and sort of take over by challenging this d5 pawn. Bishop e3, king d6, more checks, and the game was eventually drawn. And in fact, it was actually black who decided to shake things up first, playing this move f5 before white got the chance to even try anything. Gf, bishop takes, king e4, knight h4, and this position is just a draw. With black just passing the time. Just passing the time. Notably, if white ever tries king f5, this is sort of the only thing you can try. Then king takes d5, and the game was agreed to a draw. So there are a few points I want to get across with this endgame that hopefully you guys are able to sort of internalize. Number one, this idea of not thinking about specific moves in these endgames. Don't think about move by move by move. Think about a way to make progress. Find some idea, some way to make progress in the game and focus on that. Don't focus on, just some general idea of improving the pieces, putting them on better squares. Focus on a way to make tangible progress, and that's how you're going to find the winning plans. If you try stuff like knight b8 and sort of just shuffle around, trying to improve the pieces somehow, maybe here, maybe a3 for some reason, you're not gonna make progress. You need a tangible idea. That's the first and foremost thing I hope you guys can get from this. Okay. Secondly, this idea of the defending side sort of slowing down that idea of making progress. The defensive side should also be trying to find ways for the opponent to try to make progress and doing their best to solve those problems before they actually arrive. In this case, g5 and f6. And thirdly, you can go even deeper, and with the attacking side, looking at potential setups for your opponent like g5 and f6 and trying to play against them. That's how you can arrive at really key moves like f4 in this position. That's how you can discover these types of ideas. So any questions on this endgame now before we move on? If after f4, black plays bishop f5, I think we could just capture this guy. I think this is going to be good enough. This guy is sort of indefensible, right? The king can't come to e6, and I think it's just as simple as attacking this pawn. Knight g3, but now you're not in time to stop king e5. King e7 means this, king c7 means this, and we didn't quite have time to play f6 to stop knight c4 check. Could black put his knight on d6 and his bishop on e7 as a defense? d7 he means after f4. Let's take a look. Let's say bishop d7, and white continues with this idea. King c7, I guess. Well, no, this would give up king e5. So, yeah, I guess the issue is going to be that king e5 is always going to be too strong, right? Going to be too strong here. Does that make sense? And if you tried a little bit later, let's say knight c5, knight e3, king e7. Well, yeah. Let's even give black a move here to play knight d6. I think knight c4 is going to be good enough to win. Well, actually, maybe not because of knight takes c4. I think g4, g5 is likely going to be good enough, and king e5 is still going to be sort of this devastating threat, right? So not only tactically does it work out, but I think even if you achieve this, I don't think it's going to be good enough for black here. Yeah, pretty sure. Pretty sure g4 is going to be good enough. If you go back to these ideas of f5, still you're running into problems over here and problems of king e5 threats. Maybe not immediately, but king e5 threats. And this is also coming as well. Difficult position, difficult position. Okay. How many moves was this game? The actual game continuation took 83 moves. This position that we were looking at to start with here was move 36. But many of those moves were after black had achieved the defensive setup, and white was sort of trying and trying and trying, but not getting anywhere, as we've seen. Let us now move on to a game between Kirill Alexeyenko, who was, I believe, the Russian pick for the wild card in this candidates, against everybody's favorite player, Anish Giri. Who doesn't love a good old-fashioned Anish Giri game? So let's take a look here. The starting position I want to look at is this one after the move queen f6. We have on our hands a very complex endgame that involve the queens and the knights. The first question I want to ask is, who should be better in this endgame? And this one is probably going to be a little bit more intuitive than the last one. The last one is, not counterintuitive, but you could kind of see how the d pawn might be a weakness. In this case, of course, it is just white with all of the weaknesses here. The d pawn is weak, the b pawns are weak, and white does not have enough activity to make up for it. So yes, black is going to be better in this case. So let's see what happens in the game for the next few turns, and then we'll slow down and think about it. So for the moment, black is making a threat. White plays the move queen e4 to defend it. We have g6 by black. It's always a good idea to play against the knight in these kinds of positions, also making left for the king. We have knight e2, and now we have the move knight e6. And now white comes up with a pretty interesting idea to try and pressure the black king a little bit. He goes with the move h4, and perhaps with some ideas of playing h5 and even h6 a little bit later on to, like I said, pressure the black king. But black's having none of it. He plays the move h5, and white plays the move g3. And I wanted to include these moves because I think this is a really instructive structure that both players have created here. I was actually talking to a friend of mine who was playing a rapid game just online, and he had some decisions to make about which pawn structure to go for on the king side, while the endgame play kind of continued on the queen side of the board. And that's a situation that I think players run into a lot. They have 3 versus 3 on the king side, some other situation on the queen side of the board where play is a little bit more interesting. This is sort of where the game's going to be decided. But first, both players sort of have to decide what they want their king side pawns to look like before they can get to the meat of the game over here on the queen side. And this structure, f7, g6, h5, is a structure I see high-level grandmasters going for all the time in these endgames. And I think the reason for that is this is a very, very stable structure for both sides, f7, g6, h5. The reason for that is, of course, you never get back rank mated. The king, in fact, has options here. If it turns out the diagonal is an issue, the king can step to h7. If it turns out the 7th rank is an issue, the king can step to g7 and can always shift between the two. He has an escape route out through h6 if things get too crazy. In this case, of course, it is blocked by the h-pawn for white as well, but in some cases this is important. These pawns all defend each other. There's nothing to worry about there. The f7 pawn defends against threats from the 7th rank, the g6 pawn from this diagonal, as I've stated before. And it's sort of resilient against attacks by enemy pawns. You know, it's not so easy to break down this structure. And if you try, this structure can easily be changed into a structure that is not so bad either. For example, f3, g4 might be an attempt to change the structure, but black is usually happy to play h takes g in those situations, and then f7, g6 is almost as good as f7, g6, h5. So I wanted to highlight that both players consciously chose to create this structure in this endgame because I really do believe this is sort of the best you can do on the king side in most cases. Most cases, of course. There are exceptions, but in most cases, this is the best you can do. All right. With that in mind, let's move on with the end game. We have queen to d8. Yeah, don't know what the issue is that you guys are talking about in the chat, but hopefully it gets resolved. So queen d8 played in the game, and the idea here now is, like I said, black has created his structure on the king side, and now he can start to look for play on the queen side as well. Queen d8 just rerouting this queen. Queen e5 was white's choice, but now queen b6. And like I said, going for play on the queen side. In the meantime, of course, we see the power of black's pawn structure. Queen b8 check does nothing because at the end of the day, while this looks like perpetual, black has given himself this extra option of coming to h7. In this case, the 7th rank doesn't matter, the diagonal matters, so black can choose h7. Just wanted to highlight that one more time. Okay, so black, of course, is challenging these two pawns. White needs to do something to sort of prevent it, and so white comes up with this tactical idea of playing the move d5. We have c takes d5 on the board. If queen takes b3 were to be played, this hangs a knight, so you can't do that, of course. So c d5 played, queen d5, and now king f8. And we have these two sort of fractured pawns for white against these two slightly healthier pawns for black. And for that reason, I still would actually prefer black in this position. That being said, I do think after those slight complications, this position should more or less be drawn. However, we'll see that despite his reputation, Anish Giri is actually a very, very talented player at pushing these very slight advantages, even if technically the game is, equal, drawn. There are practical chances here for black, and Anish Giri is actually a very talented player at playing these positions for a win, sort of getting everything he can out of them. Why king f8? I'm going to be honest with you here. King f8 is a little bit mysterious, even little bit mysterious even to me. It's the type of position where rapid changes aren't really going to be happening, and king f8, I think, is just a move marking time. It's worth noting that the players are on move 34 in the game, and I do believe they got extra time at move 40, so moves like king f8 are sort of non-committal, but they're not really going to be changing the evaluation of the position. And you'll see players do that when they do have this extra time at move 40. Knight c3 was played, queen c7, knight into e4. White is just sort of activating his knight now, creating some threats around the king. Queen c1 check, and queen takes b2. So we do actually end up finding white going down a pawn here, which I sort of glossed over because I forgot it happened so quickly. I thought they did this after move 40, but no. Knight e4 was, in fact, a pawn sacrifice. And the reason Alexeyenko does this is because he thought he could go for some mating attacks against the black king. And perhaps this is also why black brought this king to f8, I should mention, stepping out of potential knight f6 checks as well. Interesting stuff. Now, was white forced to go for this? No, white was not really forced to go in for this at all. White could have very easily played something like king f1, knight a4. They could have played this position out for hours and hours and hours without anybody actually making any progress here. Instead, though, knight e4, Alekseenko wants to solve all of the issues immediately, get at this black king, get some kind of perpetual check or mating attack, and in exchange, all he has to give up is this little b2 pawn. So queen c1 check, queen takes b2, and now queen d7 is white's try to end the game. Notably, white can take on b7 here, but black would play the move queen d4. And to be honest with you, this one is likely going to be a draw as well. Maybe Alexeyenko didn't want to go for this because for the moment, this knight is actually a little bit trapped. Knight g5 isn't going to be ideal, creating a slight weakness in the king side. Still, though, this position should be drawn. Instead, Alekseenko goes queen d7 with the idea of playing for checkmate here. Now, Anish Giri, for his horrible reputation that everybody says this game is sort of in defense of him, he does not play the safe move, a safe move being something like queen e5, trying to centralize the queen, bring it back to some defensive squares. He plays b6. He says, yeah, go ahead, try to checkmate me, I want my extra pawn. So knight d6 appears on the board, and now queen f6 is defending against the checkmate. We have queen e8 check, king g7, queen d7, king g8, queen e8 check, and now, not one to go for a repetition, Anish Giri wants to play for the win, so he plays knight f8. And now we have queen c6, queen d8, knight to c4. And okay, that entire intro to this endgame was sort of just a prelude. This, I believe, is a key decision point for black that I now want to talk about. Up to this point, Anish Giri snatches this pawn on b2, decides to defend his pawn on b6, and there was sort of this tactical back and forth, which all of that is just down to calculation and tactics, which you guys already know to work on. But this is a key decision point, and this is stuff that I think you can really learn from these high-level players. So black has a decision here. Black has an extra pawn on b6. So there are two things that black can do. Black can play knight d7 and try to defend the pawn, or black can give up the pawn here. So what would you guys do with black? Would you play knight d7, try to defend b6, or something else? And if you want to play something else, please enlighten me as to what that would be. What would it be? Mateo says queen d7. Chess King says queen d3. Zayad says he would play knight d7. Nikolash wants to try to trade the queens, but he's not sure how. Manny says, why not try to hold on? That can't be bad. I mean, it's fair. It's an extra pawn. Why would you give up an extra pawn? All right, someone says knight e6. Knight d7 makes us passive, but someone else wants to play knight d7. Glesh can't seem to find the initiative. Yeah, and so this is the decision point here, and this is why I am giving so much credit to Anish Giri for this game that he ends up winning. You know, I feel like 90% of chess players, maybe 99% of chess players, would play the move knight d7, right? Your pawn's attacked. Defend the pawn. I would play knight d7. Why wouldn't you play knight d7? The issue is that after queen d6, these guys are becoming passive. Queen a8 check might unpin. You can try something like queen b7 to still hold on to both things, but you're never really breaking free here, right? You're just never really breaking out. You can't seem to find some way to advance your position and also keep this pawn defended. If you try queen c6, all of a sudden, you might be losing the game. Very difficult now to keep everything under control. So for example, you could play something like queen d5 here. You get checked though, and this pawn falls anyways. And so Anish realizes maybe that knight d7, defending this pawn, isn't really the best way to go. And so he finds the right time, which is now, to give up this pawn in exchange for activity. So this is the key decision point that I want you guys to think about in your own games. Yes, it is tempting to sort of hold on to the pawn, but even if you do maintain the pawn and white doesn't have this active counterplay right away, you sort of need to realize that b5 and a4 creating a passed pawn is sort of a pipe dream here, because you're never going to be able to control those two squares well enough when white has this control over b6. For example, I'll even just pass with black here. I'll just pass. And how are you ever achieving the move b5? I don't know. I don't know. Like, white can even just pass in this position. Doesn't need to go for the craziness. Just pass, and b5 is never happening. No way to make progress. So Anish decides to play the move knight e6. Queen d7 is another great way to give up the pawn, but I like knight e6, getting the knight back into the game. Alexeyenko tries to regain the pawn, not with queen b6, which would be met with takes, takes, and knight d4, with no comfortable way to regain this guy. If knight c4, knight b3 defends, but knight b6 instead. Now knight d4 is Giri's idea, challenging these two guys. Queen c5 was white's choice, which actually does give the pawn back up. White chose this over a move like queen b5 because, oh, well, sorry, not queen b5, over a move like, is there really no way to regain, to defend this pawn? I guess there's no way to defend this pawn, huh? So yeah, queen c5, giving up the pawn. But the point is, after queen b5, now white regains the pawn on a5, right? This is all making sense again. There's no way to sort of deal with both of these threats now for black. If you try something like queen d1 to defend the knight, you're just going to get checked into oblivion, right? Going to get checked forever and ever and ever. And, sorry, not queen there, but queen e7. And there's no way to get back to controlling f7. So white regains this pawn, but we see knight d2, queen takes a5, and now black to move and get an advantage. We have seen Anish Giri allow his opponent to liquidate everything on the queen side. In return, though, he has gotten to activate his own pieces. So yeah, some of you guys have the right idea already. It's to go queen d3. And all of a sudden, it's getting a little bit risky around this white king. And so this was the high-level stuff that made me want to go over this endgame from Anish Giri. This understanding that even if you can maintain your extra pawn, it's not going to be enough to win. In order to win, you need to have some type of proactive plan. This goes back to the first endgame we looked at. If you can't come up with a way to make progress, then you're not going to win the game, regardless of the material count. So instead, Anish Giri plays a little bit more freely, gives up this B pawn, gives up this A pawn for the B pawn, and goes for the throat with checkmate. Now, white tries to defend everything with the move queen to A1. We see queen E4 check. The king comes back to G1, and we see knight F3 check. The king comes to F1, and now black finds a nice tactic. Knight takes H4. And the point is queen H1 check threatens to pick up the queen. There's no queen A8 check because the black queen defends this. And in the words of Dmitry Komarov, we have made some triangle. And this is a beautiful bit of geometry that allows Anish Giri to gain a pawn on the king's side and still fight for the win. In the game, Alexeyenko goes for queen A8 check to try and make the draw. We have queen takes A8, knight takes A8. The knight comes back to F3, king E2, and knight E5. And now we have entered a new phase of the endgame. We are running a little bit short on time, and I've already gone over the key point of the endgame that I really wanted to highlight, this idea of giving up your extra material advantage in exchange for some way to actually make tangible progress. This is something you have to keep in mind. Material is nothing if you can't come up with a proactive way to make progress. So with all that in mind, I'm going to play through the next moves a little bit more quickly. This is a really tough endgame for Alexeyenko because this knight is so far away and the extra pawn is valuable. But we do see F4, knight G4, knight B6, and we see the black king coming all the way around now. Up and up and up. Check, knight F1 check. Some funny business here. The knight comes to G4. We have knight H3. Of course, if you take, king takes G4. These endgames are always lost. So knight H3, F6, playing against the knight, king F3, and the king circles around. And Anish tightens the grip and eventually comes up with this nice move, H4. Now knight H3 played in the game. King F5 takes, king G4, and some clever bit of play by Alexeyenko, and he was actually achieving a drawn position after all, believe it or not. This position is in fact a draw. However, he blew it, right? He fought so hard all game. Anish Giri put on so much pressure all game. And now the only thing that white needed to do to draw was push this guy forward. And now black has no way to deal with this H-pawn while also playing for the win. F4 check, for example, king D3. And if we take this guy, then white actually wins. If we try to run back with knight D5, H6, knight E7, H7, knight G6. Now it's as simple as queening and grabbing this guy and coming back to stop this pawn. It's that simple now for white. But instead of all that, Alexeyenko stumbles at the final moment, doesn't find the move H5, plays the move knight D3. Now all of a sudden, after knight D5 check, knight F4, black wins this pawn outright, and with two extra pawns here, it is enough to win the game. Giri pushing all the way home. Knight D2 check, unstoppable next with king G2 to follow. And it's a victory for Anish Giri. So really interesting endgame. It's a shame we didn't have a little bit more time to go through the pure knight endgame, but like I said, the main thing I wanted to get across is this idea of going for a proactive plan to make progress no matter the cost. We saw it in game 1 with Wang Hao missing the idea of f4 with this deep idea of preventing the defensive setup to make progress. And we see it here by Anish Giri, willing to give up the queenside extra material in order to pressure the king on the king side and try to make progress in that manner. If you're watching live, the fun is going to continue on Twitch right after this with Analyze Your Games. If you're watching the YouTube recording, this is it for us. Thank you so much for joining me here for the Endgame class. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you next time.